October 1974. Harlan County, Kentucky. The rain had stopped 3 weeks ago, but you wouldn't know it standing at the edge of Route 9 looking down at the Cutter bottomland. 30 acres of it sat under 2 feet of standing water, the way it had sat under standing water every spring and most of every autumn for as long as anyone in Garfield Township could remember. The Cutter family had tried draining it twice, once in 1951 with a borrowed pump, and once in 1963 with a county drainage contract that ate $11,000 and accomplished nothing permanent. After the second failure, old Gerald Cutter had simply stopped trying. When he died in the spring of 1973, his son Dennis listed the parcel separately from the good upland ground, priced it at $40 an acre, and waited. It sat on the market for 14 months. The men at Darnell's Feed and Supply on the square in Belfry talked about it the way they talked about most unsolvable problems, with the comfortable authority of people who had no intention of solving anything. Ronnie Prater, who ran 300 acres of tobacco up on the ridge, said the water table was broken and would never drain properly. Carl Beatty, who had the biggest corn operation in the county, said the ground was sour from years of standing water and wouldn't grow anything worth cutting. Bill Maynard from the Extension office came out twice, walked the edge of it in his rubber boots, and wrote in his official report that the parcel presented persistent drainage challenges inconsistent with economically viable row crop production. He recommended against purchase. So when word got around in August of 1974 that Eldon Rowe had signed papers on all 30 acres at $38 an acre, $1,140 total, which he paid in cash from a coffee, can he kept under the bench in his equipment shed, the reaction at Darnell's was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to pity mixed with a kind of mean amusement that men feel when someone confirms what they already believed about him. Eldon Rowe was 61 years old. He had farmed the same 80 acres his father had broken in 1912, using equipment that the rest of the county had stopped using before most of them were born. His tractor was a 1939 Farmall M that his father had bought new for the price of a good mule and had never once needed a mechanic from outside the family. His cultivator was older than that. His disc harrow had been repaired so many times that the original manufacturer's mark had been ground away, but Eldon knew who had built it and when and what steel they had used, and he maintained it accordingly. He kept his fields clean, his fences straight, his accounts paid on time, and his opinions to himself. He had never owned a television. He subscribed to 2 farm journals and read both of them cover to cover. He was at Darnell's most Saturday mornings, but he rarely spoke unless someone asked him something directly. Nobody asked him about the bottomland purchase directly. They talked around him instead, the way people do when they want someone to overhear. 38 an acre for a pond, Ronnie Prater said to Carl Beatty, loud enough to carry down the counter. Man might as well have bought himself a boat. Carl Beatty laughed at that. A couple of the younger men laughed too. Eldon Rowe was examining a display of plow points near the door. He did not look up. What most of the men at Darnell's did not know, because Eldon had not told them and had no plan to, was that he had been watching the Cutter bottomland for 30 years. Not casually, deliberately. He had walked its edges in every season. He had dug test holes in 6 different spots along its perimeter and studied the soil profiles with the kind of attention that other men gave to machinery catalogs. He had driven down to the University Extension Library in Lexington twice in the 1960s and read everything available on wetland soil conversion, natural drainage patterns, and bottomland crop potential. He had talked once, and to an old man named Clarence Stubbs, who had farmed bottomland in western Kentucky in the 1940s, using a technique that nobody in Harlan County had ever tried, and he had written down everything Clarence told him in a green composition notebook that he kept with his farm journals. The bottomland was not broken. That was the first and most important thing he knew that the Extension Office did not. The water table was not perched. The ground was not sour. The problem was simpler and more correctable than anyone had bothered to determine, because determining it required walking the entire perimeter of the property in wet conditions and reading the lay of the land the way you read a sentence, beginning to end, following the logic of it. The eastern edge of the 30 acres sat 8 inches lower than the natural drainage outlet on the county road ditch. 8 inches. That was the entire problem. Water came in from the ridge above, settled into the bowl of the bottomland, and had nowhere to go because the outlet point was slightly elevated relative to the lowest standing water. Any drain tile laid horizontally, which was what the county had done in 1963, would move some water but never fully clear the field because it couldn't pull below that 8-inch threshold. What the ground needed was not a pump or a tile system or a drainage contract. It needed a single strategic cut, a channel hand-dug or machine-dug that dropped the outlet 8 inches and gave the natural water table somewhere to go. Then it needed rice, not corn, not tobacco, not soybeans, which every ambitious farmer in Harlan County was starting to talk about in 1974. Rice, upland rice, specifically, a variety developed for Southern American growing conditions that didn't require flooding, that actually thrived in wet, heavy bottomland soil that had built up decades of organic matter from standing vegetation. The bottomland's years of flooding had not ruined it. They had made it extraordinarily rich. The soil had been composting itself for 30 years. Given proper drainage and the right crop, it would produce yields that the ridge farmers with their thin, leached tobacco ground couldn't dream of. Eldon had done the math in the green composition notebook. He had not shared the math with anyone. He bought a used Case 400 crawler from an estate sale in Pike County in September of 1974 and paid $420 for it and used it to cut the drainage channel himself over the course of 11 days in October. He worked in the early morning before the ground softened and again in the evening when it firmed up. He cut the channel 60 feet long, dropped it precisely 8.5 inches at the outlet, and lined the critical section with flat creek stone he hauled up from his own property in the bed of his 1952 Ford pickup. The water began moving within 3 days of completing the cut. Not rushing, moving. A slow, steady percolation that dropped the standing water level an inch a day through the last 2 weeks of October. By the first week of November, the lowest section of the field was still wet, but walkable. By December, 2/3 of the 30 acres had surface drained completely. The remaining 10 acres in the northwest corner held moisture, but not standing water. He planted winter rye on the dry sections in November, not for harvest, but for soil conditioning, to hold the ground, break up the compaction layer with root structure, and add organic material when he turned it under in spring. He did this quietly. He did not post signs. He did not mention it at Darnell's. People noticed the channel cut in November, and there was brief discussion of it at the feed store. "Cut himself a ditch," Carl Beatty reported. "Water's moving some. Still half underwater up in that corner." "Told you," Ronnie Prater said. "He'll spend all winter on it and still be looking at a pond in the spring." Eldon was not at Darnell's that Saturday. He was turning rye seed into the southeast corner of the bottomland with a hand seeder while the ground was still soft enough to accept it. He would be there until dark. Spring came dry that year, which was unusual for Harlan County, and by April of 1975, The bottomland had done something that nobody who drove past on Route 9 quite knew how to process. It was dry, not just surface dry, settled, firm, workable. The winter rye stood green and knee-high across 22 of the 30 acres. The northwest corner was still soft but not flooded. The drainage channel ran a thin, clear trickle into the county road ditch. Eldon Rowe planted rice in May, and he had sourced the seed variety through the mail, a southern upland strain he had been corresponding about since 1972 with a grower in Arkansas who had been developing it for exactly this kind of converted bottomland situation. The seed had arrived in February in 4 burlap bags with a handwritten note that said, "Give it heavy ground, and it will give you back more than you put in." He planted it with a modified grain drill he had adapted himself, adjusting the seed spacing for the variety's growth habit based on the Arkansas grower's specifications. The people who drove Route 9 in June saw something green and tall coming up in the bottomland, and most of them assumed it was some kind of grass that Eldon was letting take over because he had admitted defeat on any real crop. A few people thought it was sorghum. Nobody thought it was rice, because nobody grew rice in Harlan County, Kentucky. By August, it was obvious that it was not sorghum and not grass and not defeat of any kind. The plants stood 4 feet tall across the 20 acres of planted ground, thick and heavy-headed, bending slightly in the August heat with the weight of grain. The northwest corner, which Eldon had planted later and thinner given its remaining moisture, was lower and less uniform, but still clearly producing. Carl Beatty drove past on a Tuesday morning and sat in his truck on the shoulder of Route 9 for a long time looking at it. He drove to Darnell's Feed and Supply and walked in and said, without preamble, "Eldon Rowe is growing something in that bottomland, and I don't know what it is." Harvest was the last week of September 1975, so Eldon used his Farmall M with a modified attachment to cut the grain, an arrangement he had worked out over 2 evenings with his son Robert, who had driven up from Pikeville for the harvest and who had stopped asking his father to explain his plans years ago on the grounds that the plans always made sense by the time they were finished. They cut and bundled and threshed over 4 days. Robert stacked. Eldon ran the equipment. They spoke about a dozen sentences total over the 4 days, most of them related to the work. The yield from 20 acres of upland rice on converted bottomland, ground that had sold for $38 an acre 14 months earlier and that the county extension office had officially recommended against purchasing, came to 6,100 pounds of clean grain. Bill Maynard from the extension office drove out on the 4th day because someone had told him he needed to see it, and because he was, beneath his official caution, a man who genuinely wanted to understand things he didn't understand. He stood at the edge of the field with his notebook and watched Eldon and Robert finish the last cutting, and he did not write anything in his notebook for a long time. When Eldon finally shut down the Farmall M and climbed down to begin stacking the last of the bundled grain, Bill Maynard walked over to him. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "I wrote the report recommending against this parcel." "I know," Eldon said. "I'd like to understand what I missed, if you're willing." Eldon looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, just measuring. Then he said, "Walk the property with me." They walked it for an hour. Eldon talking in the plain, specific way he talked when someone was actually asking, explaining the drainage analysis, the channel cut, the outlet elevation problem, the soil chemistry that years of standing water had created rather than destroyed. He showed Bill Maynard the drainage channel. He showed him the test hole profiles he had dug and noted in 1967 and compared them to the current soil structure. He explained the rice variety and why it suited the ground. Bill Maynard filled 4 pages of his notebook. At the end of the walk, he said, You knew all of this before you bought it. Yes, Eldon said. How long had you been studying it? Eldon considered. Since about 1944, he said. Bill Maynard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What I wrote in that report, I was wrong. The drainage analysis I should have done and didn't was the channel outlet elevation. I looked at the field in wet conditions and concluded it was undrainable. I didn't measure the outlet relative to the water table. No, Eldon said, you didn't. That was the whole problem. That was the whole problem, Eldon agreed. They shook hands at the edge of the field while Robert loaded the last of the bundled grain onto the truck bed. Robert had heard most of the conversation. He stacked quietly and did not comment. The story spread through Garfield Township the way stories spread in 1975, person to person, at the feed store, at the diner on Main Street in Belfry, at the First Baptist Church on Sunday mornings. It spread imperfectly, the way all real stories do, accumulating detail and losing detail at different points. But the core of it stayed intact because the core of it was too simple to distort. Eldon Rowe had bought the ground everyone said was worthless, grown a crop nobody thought possible, and done it with equipment that was already 30 years old when he bought the ground. Ronnie Prater drove out to look at the field on a Saturday in early October after the harvest was complete and the ground was turned under for winter cover. He stood at the fence line on Route 9 and looked at the turned soil for a while. The drainage channel was visible from the road, a clean, straight cut that ran from the field's low corner to the road ditch. He had driven past that field 100 times over the past year and had not seen what it meant. He drove to Darnell's and walked in and said nothing about Eldon Rowe. Carl Beatty said nothing either, which was more unusual for Carl than for Ronnie. Eldon was at the counter buying plow points. He paid, put the plow points in the paper bag they gave him, and said good morning to both men as he left. He drove home in the 1952 Ford pickup and spent the rest of the morning greasing the Farmall M and noting the service in the maintenance log he had kept on that tractor since he had taken it over from his father in 1953. Bill Maynard did something that took more character than most people in his position would have shown. He rewrote the extension report on the Cutter bottomland parcel, now the Rowe bottomland, and filed it with the county and with the state agricultural office in Frankfort. In the revised report, he documented the original error in the drainage analysis. I explained the correct methodology for outlet elevation measurement in relation to water table and described in detail the soil profile advantages that had been created by the parcel's history of flooding rather than destroyed by it. He included the rice variety information and yield data. He also, in a paragraph near the end of the report that he wrote 3 times before he was satisfied with the phrasing, acknowledged that Eldon Rowe had performed a more thorough and accurate site analysis than the Extension Office had provided and recommended that the county adopt outlet elevation measurement as a standard step in any wetland or bottomland drainage assessment going forward. The state office sent a letter acknowledging receipt. 2 counties over. But a drainage assessment the following spring included the outlet measurement as a standard step because someone in the Frankfort office had read Bill Maynard's revised report and passed it to the right person. Bill Maynard kept a copy of the revised report in a folder in his filing cabinet. He also kept, folded inside that folder, a single sheet of paper on which he had written, the evening after walking the Rowe bottomland, the 4 pages of notes he had taken. He looked at it occasionally, not out of guilt. He had moved past guilt fairly quickly because guilt wasn't useful, but because it was a record of something he had learned, and he was the kind of man who valued records of things he had learned. He told the story to his successor when he retired from the Extension Office in 1981. He told it specifically and completely, are including the part where he had written the wrong report and what the error had been, and how he had identified it. His successor, a younger man named Gary Fulton, who had gone to agricultural college at UK and had a great deal of confidence in his training, listened politely and said he would keep it in mind. 3 years later, Gary Fulton assessed a 40-acre parcel in the next county, recommended against purchase on drainage grounds, and then spent an evening going back through his notes before calling Bill Maynard at home to ask one question. Had he measured the outlet elevation? He had not. He drove back out the next morning, measured it, and revised his assessment. The farmer who had inquired about the parcel bought it, drained it correctly, and planted it in soybeans. The yield surprised him. He never knew why Gary Fulton had changed his recommendation. Gary Fulton never told him. But Gary Fulton remembered, and he measured outlet elevations on every wetland assessment he performed for the remaining 20 years of his career, and the farmers in 3 counties were better for it. Eldon Rowe farmed the bottomland for 11 more years. He rotated the rice with winter rye and 1 year of soybeans to maintain the soil structure, following a rotation schedule he had worked out in the green composition notebook and adjusted based on what he observed. He added 4 acres of the northwest corner to production in the 2nd year as that section firmed up completely. He sold the rice through a grain buyer in Pikeville who was initially skeptical and then became reliably enthusiastic as the quality of the grain established itself over successive harvests. He never made a large amount of money from the bottomland. He made a consistent, reliable amount of money, more per acre than the ridge tobacco farmers were netting in most years, and with considerably less labor and chemical input. He was not competing with them. He was farming his ground the way his ground asked to be farmed, which had always been his approach to the 80 home acres, and which he had simply extended to 30 more. He did not attend any agricultural conferences or speak at any county meetings. He did not write any articles for the farm journals he subscribed to, though he read them as carefully as he always had. When people asked him questions, he answered them honestly and completely. When people did not ask questions, he did not offer information. This was simply how he operated. In 1982, Robert moved back to Harlan County from Pikeville with his wife and their 2 boys, having decided that farming was what he wanted to do and that his father's ground was where he wanted to do it. Eldon turned over the day-to-day operation of the home place to Robert by degrees over the following 2 years, moving himself to an advisory role that suited his age and that Robert navigated with the same quiet competence he had always shown. The bottomland Eldon managed himself until 1986. That spring, at 73, he sat down with Robert one evening and went through the green composition notebook page by page, the 30 years of soil notes, the drainage analysis, the yield records, the rotation schedule, the Arkansas grower's original letter folded into the back cover. He explained everything that needed explanation, which was not a great deal because Robert had watched most of it happen. He signed the bottomland title over to Robert that summer. Robert planted rice that fall the same way his father had planted it, same variety, sourced now through a second Arkansas grower who maintained the strain, same modified drill, same rotation logic. He serviced the Farmall M the same way his father had, noted the service in the same maintenance log, and ran the drainage channel clean every spring with a flat spade to keep the outlet clear. His boys grew up working that field. The older one, Daniel, was 12 in 1986 and old enough to have spent 3 harvests working alongside his grandfather, watching him move through the bottomland with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. Daniel asked questions. Eldon answered them. The answers went into Daniel the way good soil information goes into a person who is ready for it, not as rules exactly, but as a way of seeing, The Farmall M sat in the equipment shed through the winters, started once a month the way Eldon had always started it, the maintenance log filling up with Robert's handwriting now, where Eldon's had been before. It went to the Harlan County Farm Days exhibition in 1984, 1987, and 1991, where people walked past it and said things like, "You don't see many of those anymore," and that old girl still running and occasionally asked Robert how old it was. He told them. They usually said something respectful and moved on to look at the newer equipment. The Farmall M sat in the same spot every year, green paint chalked with age, every fitting greased, engine turning over on the first or second pull of the hand crank. It never failed to start. The spring of 1993 was the wettest Harlan County had seen since 1957. The creek bottoms flooded in March and stayed high through April, and farmers who had expanded their operations onto marginal low ground in the profitable years of the late 1980s found themselves looking at fields they couldn't plant and wondering what to do about it. One of those farmers was a man named Terry Goff, who had bought 60 acres of creek-bottom ground east of Belfry in 1988 when commodity prices were strong and a local bank was lending freely against projected yields. He had planted corn on it for 4 seasons with acceptable results. In the spring of 1993, he had 4 feet of water standing in the middle of it and a loan payment due in June. He had a county drainage contractor out in April who ran 2 hydraulic pumps for 8 days and spent $4,000 of Terry's money moving water from one part of the field to another without resolving the fundamental drainage problem, which was, though nobody identified it in those terms, an outlet elevation issue nearly identical to what Eldon Rowe had diagnosed on the Cutter bottomland 19 years earlier. By May, Terry Goff was at Darnell's Feed and Supply, asking anyone who would listen whether there was anything to be done, and the conversation was essentially the same conversation that had happened at that counter in 1974. Comfortable, an authoritative men explaining all the reasons why nothing could be fixed. Robert Rowe was at the counter that morning buying chain for a fence repair. He was 51 years old, quiet in the way his father had been quiet, wearing the same kind of worn canvas jacket Eldon had worn. He listened to the conversation for a while, then he said to Terry Goff, "What's your outlet situation?" Terry Goff looked at him. "My what?" "Your drainage outlet. Where does the water go when it leaves the field, and have you measured the elevation of that point against your water table?" Terry Goff had not measured it. The drainage contractor had not measured it. The bank that had lent against the field had certainly not measured it. Robert said, "Let me come look at it." He walked the field with Terry Goff on a Thursday afternoon. He borrowed his son Daniel's surveying level to take the measurements and identified the outlet elevation problem in about 40 minutes of careful work. The fix was a channel cut of roughly 80 feet that would drop the outlet 6 inches. The estimated cost of the channel cut, done with the Case 400 crawler that Robert had inherited along with everything else, was 2 days of work and the fuel to run the machine. $4,000 in pump rentals had not solved it. A channel cut would. Terry Goff stood at the edge of his flooded field and looked at the measurement notes Robert had written on a piece of paper torn from a small notebook and said, "Why didn't the drainage contractor find this?" Robert folded the paper and handed it to him. "Same reason the extension office missed it on our bottomland in 1974, he said. "They looked at the water and decided the problem was too much water. Didn't look at where the water needed to go." He cut the channel in 2 days the following week. The field began draining within 3 days. By the end of May, Terry Goff had 52 of his 60 acres in planted condition. He put soybeans in, not corn. The season was too far advanced for corn, and harvested a reduced but serviceable crop in September that covered his loan payment with enough remaining to begin paying down the principal. He told the story at Darnell's that fall, completely and accurately, giving Robert Rowe the full credit and explaining the outlet elevation measurement in enough detail that two other men in the store went home that evening with the concept in their heads and applied it in different ways in the following years. Robert charged Terry Goff nothing. Terry Goff, unprompted, made a $50 donation to the Harlan County Historical Society, which had a small agricultural equipment collection housed in a building behind the county courthouse. He told the Historical Society director it was because of an old farmer named Eldon Rowe who had always said the county ought to remember how things were done. The Historical Society director did not know Eldon Rowe. She filed the donation and wrote a thank-you note. Daniel Rowe was 30 years old in 1993 and farming alongside his father by then. Had been since finishing his 2 years at the community college in Pikeville and deciding, the same way his father had decided and his grandfather before that the ground was where he needed to be. He had his grandfather's green composition notebook, which Robert had given him on his 21st birthday, with the explanation that Eldon would have wanted him to have it. He had read it all the way through 3 times. He kept it in the same equipment shed where the Farmall M lived. He started the Farmall M on the 1st of every month. He noted the start in the maintenance log. He greased every fitting on the specified schedule. He had replaced the magneto in 1990 and the carburetor float in 1992, and had rebuilt the governor in 1988. All of it documented, all of it done with parts sourced from a dealer in Ohio who specialized in antique Farmall components, and who had once told Daniel that the M was one of the most honestly built tractors International Harvester ever produced, meaning that it had been designed to be repaired by the person using it rather than requiring specialized tools or dealer service. Eldon had known that when he bought it. Daniel knew it now in the way you know something that was always true and that you have finally lived long enough to verify. The bottomland was still producing rice in 1993. It was still producing it in 2001 when Daniel took over the full management of the property after Robert's knee surgery made the field work difficult. The drainage channel needed clearing every 3 years or so. Silt and vegetation would begin to narrow it, and Daniel would go through it with a flat spade over the course of a morning, keeping the outlet clean. The rest of the field maintained itself the way well-managed ground maintains itself, building organic matter year by year, the rotation keeping the soil biology active and balanced. The 30 acres that had sold for $38 an acre in 1974, the ground that Ronnie Prater had called a pond that the Extension Office had officially recommended against, that the whole county had watched Eldon Rowe buy with the tolerant amusement reserved for a man they had already decided was eccentric. Those 30 acres had been in continuous productive use for 27 years. They had never flooded again after the first winter. They had produced grain in every season they were planted. They had been, per acre, among the most productive ground in Garfield Township for a generation. Nobody at Darnell's Feed and Supply talked about it as a remarkable thing anymore. It had been true for long enough that it was simply true. Part of the fixed geography of what was known, like the fact that the ridge ground was thin and the creek bottoms were rich, and the Rowe family had always known what to do with difficult ground. The Farmall M was still in the equipment shed in the fall of 2003, when Daniel's oldest daughter, 15 years old, already spending her after-school hours in the fields and equipment barn, with the unself-conscious purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, asked him why he kept starting it every month if they didn't use it for field work anymore. Daniel was greasing a fitting on the front axle when she asked. He finished the fitting before he answered. "Because the month you stop starting it," he said, "is the month it becomes something that doesn't run. And once it becomes something that doesn't run, pretty soon it becomes something nobody remembers how to fix. And once that happens, you've lost something you can't get back just by wanting it." She considered this for a moment. "Is that why Grandpa Eldon kept it?" "And his father before him, and now me." He handed her the grease gun. "You know which fittings are next." She did. She had been watching him do this since she was old enough to follow him into the equipment shed. She moved to the next fitting without being told again. The Farmall M turned over on the second pull of the hand crank, the way it almost always did, the engine catching with the same deep, settled sound it had made since 1939, a sound that had outlasted the companies that had tried to replace it and the experts who had recommended against what it helped build, and the neighbors who had been so certain that 30 acres of flooded ground was 30 acres of nothing. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. The engine ran for 20 minutes in the cold autumn air, the way Eldon had always run it, long enough to circulate the oil, warm every surface, confirm that everything was exactly as it should be. Then Daniel shut it down and noted the start time in the maintenance log, the way his father had before him and his grandfather before that, a record kept in the same battered book that had begun in 1953 and had never missed a month. Outside, the bottomland lay turned and settled under the October sky, unresting through its winter, ready for spring. It had been proving people wrong for 29 years. It had a great deal of proving left to do,